Are you familiar with the term movement capture? Because if not, you need to get acquainted real quickly. Whether you volunteer with a nonprofit working for a social justice, pro-democracy, environmental, human rights cause, etc., whether you're interested in how social movements form and advance, including the one that we are involved in right now, or whether you are a consumer of independent media, you tell I'm going to bring it back around to the last one real hard. You need to know what movement capture is. So movement capture refers to the process where a larger, well-financed benefactor or partner captures a social movement by overly influencing or directing entirely the original goal or mission of the movement. Another word for movement capture is co-optation, where the billionaires, the dark money, those with power and influence, swing in, and they, either through funneling money into an organization or paying their folks to infiltrate an organization or a movement, they actually take over that movement and they navigate it the way they want it to go in order to protect their own power, in order to conform the world to their worldview, to shape society in a way that continues to benefit them. In a nation where we are living under a kleptocracy, where the billionaires, the oligarchs, are given tremendous amounts of power, where corruption is the name of the game, where our Supreme Court has decided that corporations have the rights of people, where dark money is everywhere in our politics, in our government, in our media ecosystems. We have to understand what movement capture is and how it happens. We have to be aware of when the cause we care about or the platform that we think is independent, or the progressive candidate who got elected and suddenly is changing his tune and voting for crypto bro legislation that benefits the regime, for example, or voting for the Laken Riley Act, for example. I have so many examples. We have to understand how dark money, billionaire money, comes in and purchases movements, just good causes, how it twists and changes the narrative from independent media, how it can buy elected officials, how sometimes those folks and those organizations are bought and paid for from the beginning, and they just have this veneer. There's just this like facade of them being legitimate, organic as a movement. There's straight up dissembling going on. Movement capture itself, though, definitely involves a legitimate grassroots organization, a legitimate social movement, a legitimate cause that, like any good cause under an oligarchy, is struggling to find funding, and then money comes in and says, we're just going to give you this money to continue to do the good work that you're already doing. There's definitely no strings attached. We're definitely not going to use our money and power and influence to take over your social movement and steer it the way we want it to go. Either just tweak it a little bit or totally take it off the rails, sometimes even drive it into the ground on purpose. Movement capture, co-optation, is something that the wealthy use on purpose to sabotage the success of a movement, to prevent that movement from attaining its goal. Forge Organizing had a really good piece way back in 2021 on this, and it had to do with movement capture and the Black Lives Matter movement. The piece is by Megan Ming Francis and Erica Cole Arenas, and I'm just going to share a little bit of it with you. I encourage you to go read the whole piece. After the murder of George Floyd, a global uprising against systemic racial injustice was ignited. During the initial weeks of the uprising, millions of people took to the streets to protest, but big philanthropy was relatively quiet. As the protests waged on in June and into July, many philanthropists and foundations eventually named structural racism as a problem and issued statements of solidarity with the protesters. And under mounting pressure from staff to back up their words with money, corporate philanthropy and foundations ramped up their response by increasing investments in racial equity work. The $12 billion in commitments between June 2020 and January 2021 constituted the largest giving in the area of racial equity in philanthropy's entire history. I mean, you wonder why rescinding DEI policies was one of the initial goals of the regime. And how is it that they positioned themselves to do that so neatly and quickly? Let's continue here. But what does this flurry of action around racial equity in the philanthropic sector actually mean? Is it a real sign of transformative change? Foundation leaders may have issued statements in support of racial justice, but most were still uncomfortable naming the institution of policing or the system of violent racial capitalism as problems. After all, these philanthropists rely on the system of exploitive racial capitalism in order to maintain their wealth and power. So they're not going to be interested in dismantling those systems of oppression. They benefit from them. And this is where movement capture comes into play. The powerful protecting the systems that have empowered them and enriched them in the first place. As scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it, they, meaning the super rich philanthropists, rely on twice stolen wealth. Stolen once by industries that profited from underpaid or unpaid, predominantly black and brown labor and or the exploitation of the environment, and then a second time through charitable tax deductions that place this wealth in philanthropic endowments that are privately managed, mostly by white trustees. This next paragraph touches on a subject that I've covered extensively, how philanthropy is largely a scam. It's used to reinforce the system, not bring about justice, but let me read it here. Foundation leaders wanted racial justice on their own performative terms. Change, but not so much change as to upend the entire system. Even if we recognize that philanthropy is a creature of capitalism and thus unwilling to address policing and carceral systems, it can still do much more to support social movements for racial, economic, and social justice. Philanthropists could start by pledging not to repeat the mistakes of the past, specifically the practice by which private philanthropy uses its influence to shape the agenda and strategies of civil rights organizations. History is rife with examples of what Megan Ming Francis, one of the authors of this article, has dubbed movement capture. The piece goes on to talk about farm laborers and field workers' rights movements and how they were initially funded based very much on dues from participants, from folks who are being impacted. But then philanthropic organizations come in with grants and then they form agreements. They act like they're allies initially, but then that money starts to drive the narrative. It starts to shape the organization. The organizers within the movement are afraid to speak out in a way, to move in a way that threatens that funding, that displeases the philanthropists. The money from these philanthropic organizations funds ad campaigns. It changes the narrative. It hires their people and puts them in positions to influence the movement. That is movement capture. So jumping down in the article quite a bit and jumping forward to the BLM movement. Once again, big philanthropy is acting in ways that undermine racial movements for justice. Instead of answering the call of some of the most marginalized citizens in our society, many in philanthropy have cozied up to the corporations that have made life miserable for so many in the first place. For example, they have gaslighted us with this new social bond initiative underwritten by Wells Fargo Securities. They've used valuable political capital to advocate for corporate accountability instead of more direct and effective actions like the authors here argue defunding the police. The tension between foundation leaders and abolition-centered organizations, including those engaged in the invest-divest movement toward a more fully just and caring world, points to a central problem in philanthropy. Many funders want to fund movement building, but do not actually know what that entails. Deep investments in movement building would require funders to engage deeply in the history of social movements, to shift how they evaluate success, and to adopt longer time horizons. If funders want to decrease the degree of movement capture in the present moment, they must transform internal and external grant-making processes. In particular, foundations need to look internally to foundation processes that have undermined movements. Externally, funders need to do more and be much better at trusting the vision of organizers from the communities that are affected by the issue. While I agree with all of that, and I appreciate that the authors here understand the utility of being funded by philanthropic groups, and while I appreciate and acknowledge my own bias because I come from an anti-capitalist perspective, I think philanthropy is a scam. I think the super rich need to be taxed out of existence. And while I have been for many months sounding the alarm about dark money influencing not only our elected officials, we've got to overturn Citizens United. A majority of Americans want it overturned, by the way. Also, all of the dark money that is funneling into new media. Was that new media originally an organic outgrowth? Wanting true social change? How much has dark money, big money, establishment money come in and captured that movement? This is one of the reasons I keep saying we need a code of ethics for creators online. We need disclosure. And we all have to get a lot more savvy, a lot more hyper aware about the way that money captures movements, captures media, captures politicians. In order to prevent social change, to make sure that the system is maintained so that they maintain their power. Who are we trusting and watching and listening to right now that the super rich are using to create controlled opposition?